the moderator, who really needs no introduction, my longtime colleague now of 24 years, is it, Amy? 24 years since Democracy Now! Started in 1996, and really one of the truly great journalists of our time, Amy Goodman, and she will introduce the panelists and moderate the discussion for the rest of the evening.
But this is just to say that so many people have been a part of this independent media movement. Juan and I were in the streets of Seattle in 1999. Dee Dee was filming. It was our first attempt at doing a television show, that we were just doing radio at the time. And it really is so interesting that Juan's other DN, that's the Daily News, which at the time was this massive newspaper in New York that served millions, when he went to them, and he mentioned this before this film, and said, you know, would they send him to the WTO protests? They said, the who? And he goes on his own time, on Democracy Now!'s dime, because we're working on this project together, and before you know it, they're calling him, and every few minutes, we need another headline. And I also just want to comment that when you looked at the media in Seattle, you had television stations like Como that were put out a memo that said no reporter is to name any person or organization that engaged in civil disobedience, right? By that rule, we would never have known who Dr. Martin Luther King was, or others, if that was applied in other situations. But to give a sense of the media at the time, when the CNN was reporting that no rubber bullets were being used, indymedia.org was showing people holding handfuls of rubber bullets, and indymedia.org was getting more hits, over 1 million hits, than CNN.com. This was really the rise of independent media, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Not only back in 1999, but then talk about what this means for today, and for liberation movements from back in Seattle to the Arab Spring to, well, what we're seeing today and the forms of independent media that are flourishing today. So we're going to begin with Jeff Pearlstein, who you saw in the film, who was co-founder of Seattle Indie Media and Media Action Grassroots Network. Jeff, just talk about how you ended up putting together Indie Media, how this all happened.
How do we put it together? Well, I think there's a lot that could be said about that. But what I wanted to mention, you were just saying that, Juan's editors didn't know about WTO, and I'll just, to be honest, cop to it that, in March of 1999, I didn't know what the WTO was. And I was pretty plugged into organizing and social activist work at that point in time. And there were starting to be these weekly meetings in Seattle, as someone who'd been living there for about 7 years at that point, doing a lot of activism and that sort of stuff. Weekly meetings by different organizing coalitions that had come to town to help set up, but also folks who were affiliated with movement organizations in the Global South who were doing these kind of teach-ins, kind of build awareness. And I was fortunate to attend a couple of those, and over time got a sense, this is going to sound kind of silly to say now, but that this was kind of big, and something was really happening, and there was a lot of people going to maybe be coming to town. This was really significant, of course, politically, being involved in media activist work up to that time, mostly in pirate radio, doing some cop watch work and that sort of stuff, having connected with folks nationally and internationally in some of the existing networks, whether that was Paper Tiger TV and Deep Dish TV and community radio networks and on, public access centers. I was connected with folks, and we were inspired by, as was mentioned earlier, Marcos's call, actually, in '97, very, very clearly and explicitly, and you kind of, the punchline now, right? He says there's an option, there's conformity, and there's skepticism, and there's a third option, is that we can create something new with our optimism and hope and connecting us all together. So the punchline, we chose a third option. And we just basically set about to try to figure out how we could put together something that would hopefully match the dynamism of the social movements with what we had on the media activist side. And I just want to mention too around that, just as far as the unique character of what we put together. There were unique aspects of it, but again, just to be real, that it wasn't entirely new, right? I think it's important to acknowledge and for all of us to understand the history of activist media, radical media, both in the US and globally, and a lot of us had a sense of that. But there were some aspects that were unique, and of course the website being the most significant one that really kind of amplified what were already existing kind of networks and collectives and that sort of thing that allowed a global reach. But I also think the character of the way people were organizing was really crucial. I mean, it was a political commitment as far as being highly participatory, horizontal, being non-hierarchical, confronting the hierarchies that we see in our society and the capitalism pushes upon us. So that was a political commitment that we had, and I think was really crucial to the growth of the network as well as the way it played out in Seattle. But also it was practical too. I mean, just being real. You know, like there was no budget, there was no existing organization, there was fairly modest infrastructure in Seattle at the time. You know, we didn't have an actual place until like 2 weeks before. You know, we were building studios and wiring the place up until literally like the night before. You know, Mansour and Matthew, you know, put the first post on the website on the 24th. Again, you know, just as far as the dates for everybody, you know, N30 is the big day of action, right? So that's a week before. And I have the post written here somewhere. I might pull out at some point. But the actual open publishing function wasn't live for several days, and they were there were coders all over the globe that were part of this team that they were coordinating, and they were stressing. I mean, we were all stressing about, you know, just having the electrical outlets up, and as well as, you know, the details of, you know, how the video team, Rick can talk about this, and others, you know, how the video teams were going to deal with all the encoding and all this sort of stuff that we take for granted today, right, because everything's digital. So there were lots of details that needed to be planned out, and I'm going to wrap up my comments just by, before I go on too long, say that there's a really great article I want to encourage people to look up that's been written, and there's a number of people posting articles for the 20th anniversary by this organizer, Chris Dixon, who was involved with the Direct Action Network, which is kind of the direct action side of things, of which the media was kind of a complementary, analogous side, I'd say, on the indie media side. And kind of it's about dispelling some myths from Seattle. And there's three, I'll just mention them, and maybe we'll probably touch on them as the conversation goes on. One, the first myth was that it was new, right? And I've already talked about that a little bit. And while there were unprecedented aspects, there's a lot that came before it was built on. The second is that it was spontaneous. And while it did seem spontaneous to many people who were taken by surprise, there were months and in some cases years of planning. And as we know, you know, for example, with the Zapatistas, you know, before even they emerged in '94, you know, up to 10 years of planning, right, in the hills and mountains and organizing. And similarly, there'd been work built up over many years around this. And the third interesting point is that it was magical, that there was some unique alchemy that happened. And I think there were unique aspects, but what they're pointing to there is that two things. They said that it was flawless, which we know it certainly wasn't. And then the other piece is that it can't be replicated. So I hope we'll kind of, you know, be talking about the ways that people have taken up the models, critiqued it appropriately, and they're very important critiques that we should address as well, but also have kind of made aspects of it their own, been inspired by it, changed it, and all that sort of stuff. So I'll pass on the mic back to Amy or to Rick.
Next up is Rick Rowley, filmmaker extraordinaire, Oscar-nominated, award-winning, began as co-founder of Big Noise Films with Jackie Suin. It was right there in the streets of Seattle, and so much of this footage was.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Thank you for organizing this. It's amazing to be back here 20 years later with so many of the people who I had the honor to share the streets with those days. I mean, and the scrappy video we produced, you know, every day a half hour of it, that was, you know, rushed by bicycle courier at dawn to make it to the satellite uplink so that, you know, a half hour of television could be on every day. It still is. It was not nominated for an Oscar, but but I mean it was. it was an idea that seemed at the time audacious to be kind and just totally insane and impossible to be kind of realistic. I mean, this is, so there were, I'm rambling, so I'll focus. When our small team came to Seattle to be part of this massive convocation that Jeff and Indy Media Seattle were created, our hopes were not particularly high. We didn't expect very much. I mean, this was, the 90s were for us the absolute political rock bottom for kind of social movements in the Americas, I mean, the labor movement had been, beaten up for like decades by Thatcher and Reagan. The national liberation movements in the guerrilla in Latin America had been murdered in the mountains in the 80s. There was NAFTA had been signed. The Democratic Party, for what it was ever worth, was completely incorporated into financial capital. History had ended. It was the close of the century. It was the end of the century and the end of history, and change was over. The social movements that previous generations had were, we're taught to believe we weren't going to see those things happen again. We were alone in our moment, locked in this time between birth and death, with no history before us, no future that would change after us, just consumers maximizing some combination of surplus product and leisure time in our moment here. And then, Tuesday night, November 30th, I remember, the National Guard was called out, and we were roaming around in the streets with camcorders and no gas mask because I was an idiot, and you'd see, the National Guard came out. We were ordered to go. We were ordered to go home or to go to jail, and people didn't go, and it was I couldn't believe it. It was and you looked around and everyone was masked, but anyway, sorry. So, but we were together in a profound way that I'd never felt in this country before, and have rarely felt since. But have been lucky enough to touch that, other times, lifetimes ago. But and it was because of the genius of the political organizing that was being done by the movements in Seattle, which was mirrored in the genius of the kind of organizing work that Jeff was doing, which was a distant echo of the genius of the Zapatistas' organizing principles. I mean, I actually ended up in Seattle because it was the end of a film tour. We were touring the country in this ragged underground, we had a minivan and 20,000 VHS tapes of our film Zapatista, and we were going town to town, screening it everywhere we could, and we christened the Independent Media Center in Seattle with it, and so, I mean, what inspires about the Zapatistas, one of the many things was they said, our word is our weapon. We're armed with our word against a first world military, and we're winning. And they won and continue to win because they told a story about their struggle that was an invitation to everyone to read themselves in as participants and not as supporters and not as followers on the outside. So, when we were in Mexico City 5 years earlier, with 300,000 people in the Zocalo. I mean, people marched, and they didn't say the war's, 1,000 miles away in the jungle. They said the war's right here under our feet, and we are Zapatistas. So that radical humility and openness that invited people to participate in this movement, without being subsumed in it, was mirrored in the organizing of the direct action, and was present in the media organization, in that we came in as a collective of collectives, and we produced these things jointly. And I should pass the microphone.
Next up is Henda Shenawi, and she is an independent journalist, organizer, sociologist, and writer at Intifada in Tunis, Tunisia. We got a chance to meet today when she came over to Democracy Now! But if you could start off by saying, what does Intifada mean? I think we have a pretty good idea.
Okay. First, thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here with you. I come from Tunisia. As you know, Tunisia, the first country of the uprising, the Arabic uprising. So Intifada is an independent media which was founded in 2014 by journalists and graphic designers and other also, as you know, working on media. And it's independent. Why and how it is independent? Because people who are working as journalists, they are also selling or giving other services to have our own funds. So it is a way, and it's the first media who is doing this in Tunisia. And it works. It's really working good. So we are working mainly in investigative journalism, and we believe that Tunisian people need slow journalism to explain what is happening, to explain it in a good way. We take time to talk about everything that mainstream media are not talking about. It's very important. So yeah, I wanted also to add that when I received the invitation for this event, so I just saw that Indy Media was created in 1999, and I said that in Tunisia something similar was happening. It's the beginning of blogging in Tunisia. Blogging is also a form of free press, independent media, with one blog or website called Takriz. Takriz means in Arabic anger, and it was related to a student movement, small student movement in Tunisia. It was the time when Ben Ali was again elected in a very undemocratic way, and it was very year when many syndicalists were in jail, journalists and other activists who were against the regime. But this Takriz, this network of students, young journalists and other activists was very important for Tunisian. Why? Because it was the first time that people started to have a platform where they think together, they can criticize the system, the regime together, and they can talk together about their country. So they started to do it, and they find a way to counter the censorship in Tunisia, and of course other people outside abroad the country can visit the website and can contribute in the website. It was the beginning of the uprising. I think it was the beginning of something new in Tunisia. And after that, 2004, we created Nawet, and then social media came, and yeah, it helped also to the social movements and the uprising in Tunisia.
Lorenzo Sarna is core organizer of Occupy Wall Street Media Working Group and co-founder of Unicorn Riot.
Hello. So my name is Lorenzo Sarna, and I first want to thank all of you for having me here. And being to speak before you I'm very honored. And I want to make that very clear. And also I want to thank all of my ancestors before me whose struggle has put me in the position right now to be able to talk to you. And make that also very clear that when I stand here, I'm not standing alone. So yeah, I'm just incredibly thankful. That's kind of why I want to start there. And I'm part of Unicorn Riot. We're a 501c3 educational nonprofit. Woo, sounds real fancy. But, you know, mic check. But when I say that, we're horizontally organized, and one of the things I learned from Occupy, from just a colleague, and much of what I've learned is from other people, because obviously that's how I learn. And I spent a lot of time listening. I've spent years listening, and I'm really excited to be able to talk, I guess. I think in Unicorn Riot, we're trying to build a culture of consent, which to us is building a culture of care, which is building a culture of resistance. And those words were given to me by somebody during Occupy Wall Street. And from that point, I've been working in media trying to think about consent more and more and more. Like, how do we actually operate in a world where people's images are just sold and monetized, and there has to be some right to that. And so I've worked in a lot of different impacted communities, for most just listening, and maybe sometimes I didn't get to hold the camera or record anything, but that wasn't what was important to me. And from that experience, I've basically just, I don't know, I've been at the forefront of a lot of different movements, sort of, and just watching them unfold over and over and over and over again. I don't even know the list. I don't know the list anymore. But what I think that we found ourselves in making Unicorn Riot is like, I didn't even know what indie media was. It's kind of a thing I've been kind of coming to terms with as being here in this celebration of indie media. But what I realizing is I had a lot of teachers who came from indie media, like Flux Rostrum, Chris Giovannis, just constant people who spent time with me to teach me what they knew. And so now I'm able to kind of take that and hopefully take it forward, because I think that's what we're all doing. I don't know, I've never felt that in the beginning of anything. I felt like I'm continuing something that happened before. And so all these people gave me this information, and I started working with some colleagues who, the biggest difference I would say from Unicorn Riot, from indie media, is that we're a group of people who just wanted to see if we could do it, Or I spent a lot of time, before Unicorn Riot, I spent a lot of time working as a tactical media trainer in different movements, working different media centers, trying to explain, how do you make a social media platform? How do you make this operate? How do you get in front of the narrative so your story can be heard? And it was exhausting, terrifying, traumatic, which I think a lot of people have experienced here, and a lot of indie media makers I think have experienced as well. One of my lessons from tactical media training is we don't get to celebrate, right? So you go, you cover the event. Everyone afterwards meets up, has drinks. They're like, yeah, we're doing it. And all the media makers are they're editing. They're on their third day of not sleeping. We're like, you're not taking care of yourself, but the person saying that's not taking care of himself, And so, yeah, it's very true. It becomes impossible, we're all human beings. And so a thing that we hold in Unicorn Riot is that the obsession with being really clear with the audience that we are human. And yeah, it's possible that we can go into a situation that could be really traumatic and bring out this footage, but we're also going to be hurt. We have members whose fingers have been blown off. Everyone's been tear gassed multiple times. The stories of editing, I'm sure again that's on this panel is during Standing Rock. I remember, if you remember, there's this moment where water cannons were used. 2 days ago, I think it's the anniversary. And we stayed up all night filming, and then I was editing in a vehicle in the middle of the winter, coughing up tear gas, trying to get the story out in the morning, because I knew that that's the only way we can have some effect on the narrative. And so when Unicorn Riot started, we didn't use Facebook. We tried really hard not to use Facebook. We have a Facebook page now, but here's again, you fall into these traps. And we're trying to just take it really seriously, because that's what we kind of were taught by everyone we worked around with, was wow, this is really serious work and it's really hard. And our experience in trying to bring people in is a lot of people were just kind of coming through to see what it was about. And we're like, well, we just want to take it real serious. So we pulled a bunch of people together. Andrew Neef, a colleague of mine, kind of called me one day when I was living in New York. He's like, why don't you quit your really good paying job and come do this and live on the floor? And I was like, okay. And now we're 5 years later, and we're still trying to make this work. And then I just want to make it really clear too that I'm before you, but my organization is very horizontal, and it's run by passion. It's run by each individual passion, and we try to support them to be able to do that work that they want to do. And we cover, we cover a lot of infrastructure fights around fossil fuel infrastructure fights, indigenous rights. We have a lot of coverage of the rise of white supremacy right now. police killings, just the homeless issue across the United States. You know, so it's just all these, and all those things are kind of forefront by the person whose passion it is to cover those things. And we're doing our best to try to empower people to just follow that and do what they want to do, and just show us what's possible. And I've spent most of my life, I would assume most of you, being told that I'm unrealistic. I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know how the world works. And I think that it's, yeah, sure, why not? You know, I don't like how the world works. So of course I'm not going to try to operate within it. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I feel like within our organization we've learned a lot about the pitfalls of resistance within like a structure of like the media kind of collapsing around us, and us this little small thing that people have noticed. So thank you.
But I wanted to start back with you, Lorenzo, because, I mean, Unicorn Riot was so critical for bringing out this different narrative of the standoff at Standing Rock. You know, the corporate media hardly touched it. But to have those video images that you were putting out, really showing people on the ground, you know, saying we're not protesters, we are water protectors, defining their own story, was so critical. And I think very much the legacy, carrying on the legacy of indymedia.org, and how you operated there on the ground with the Standing Rock Reservation and the young people who, from different tribes, who said, we're going to tell a different story.
So I think it's important to note that I did a lot of work in the plains before Standing Rock happened, and so before I talk about the media aspect, it's important for people to know that like Native people have been organizing to defend their territory since colonization. And so when Standing Rock happened, that wasn't a vacuum of a social media movement. That was literally people talking to each other day in and day out, preparing for when it could come. And our organization found ourselves at Standing Rock because we were doing work around Liberation Day, which is the anniversary of the occupation of Wounded Knee. I think it was, and we spoke to, I mean, we're going to go through this tomorrow, so it'd be great to come. And we were invited to an occupation that was supposed to happen because the Dakota Access Pipeline was going to be approved, and there was already people organizing saying that, you know, they're going to set up this camp to stop it. And also, there's again like a legacy of camps to stop things already in Indian country. It's important that we keep pushing that forward. And our organization had no money. I mean, I think we had our coffers at the time when our first trip to Standing Rock was $218. And so we had a consensus meeting, and everyone was like, yeah, this is what we're supposed to spend the money on. It's like to go cover this. This is what we're supposed to do. So like, go do it. And like 2 of us just went, and we just slept in our van outside of the casino in the winter. It was just horrible. And then we covered the beginning of the Sacred Stone camp, where they set up this camp. You know, we followed it, we made videos, and from there we just kept going back. And we kept going back. And I think that's, like, to me, like what I was just basically taught is like we're in a narrative war, and the only way you can win that narrative war is by being first and being constant. You just can't stop, you know. So once the camp was set up, we send teams back every few months. We make more videos, and then when it sort of all really kicked off, which was about August 8th, you know, I remember I was coming back from, I think the DNC or something, the RNC and DNC had just ended, and I was like, oh my God, I mean, like, right after this, I'm gonna have to go straight to Standing Rock, you know, and I did. And then from there, like, and I'll talk a little bit more, but, you know, there's a lot of the work I think that we do is just being really prepared, you know. Like, I think most of the work of media is just being really prepared. All your batteries are constantly charged. All this stuff is prepared. And when I deployed at Standing Rock, like, yeah, the internet was there, but all our plans had to do with running cards. You started at running cards. Like, what happens when everything breaks down? Like, how are we going to get this information out? And, like, it's, you know, again, it might be totally ridiculous and unrealistic. But I deployed to Standing Rock with a bailout bag, assuming that someday I might have to run into the plains and hide, because then the police might kill somebody. I might have that footage. And I had like a water filtration device, a kind of emergency blanket, some beef jerky, and I was like, I can. That's enough for me to get through a couple days, you know. If you're not prepared for like the internet to not be there, you're just not going to get information out. So I don't know if that helps.
Hinda, if you can go back to December 2010, when Mohammed Bouazizi, a university student who ends up being a fruit vendor who's being harassed by authorities to sell fruit in the marketplace, has no opportunity and sets himself on fire and sparks the Arab Spring. The Western Saharans, the Sahrawis, had also engaged in this just a month before, and but together, leading to the uprising also in Egypt, but overthrowing your own government. What independent media looked like at the time, and how important it was and integral to the struggle against corruption, for equality, for self-governance, and sending out the corrupt elite that had ruled for so long?
So in 2010, in December, we didn't have any independent media in Tunisia. We just had these two websites, Nawait and Takriz, and some blogs, and everything were like blocked in Tunisia. Tunisians, they cannot read information on internet or watch TV or read newspaper who are independent. It's very simple. And it was also forbidden to take photos on the street in public spaces, to organize meetings, to write, also you go to jail if you write an article and you distribute it, to people or something like that. So it was a dictatorship, okay? It was a real, very strong dictatorship. But what happened in 2010 is that people start to have more and more mobile phones, so they can, very easily take photos and videos about what is happening in social movements and demonstrations, and also social media. Twitter and Facebook. So Facebook helped a lot to, from Sidi Bouzid, a very small city, far from Tunis, far from the center, started the movement. A few people went out the street and to demonstrate for the first time against the regime, against Ben Ali, against the police. It was very important. And when Ben Ali, decided to kill those people, we started in Tunis to receive videos and photos from Sidi Bouzid. It was Facebook, and then, of course, some international media took these images and talked about what is happening in this time in Tunisia. So but I don't know if we can talk. Yes, of course, and people, they knew that there is something like Nawait. They maybe heard something about political left resistance in Tunisia, but they didn't have any real information or real media who can talk about their problems, about the dictatorship, and or something like that.
Rick, if you could talk about what it meant to be covering the police violence in Seattle and then move that forward to the different movements that you've covered. But, I mean, of course, what we saw there was a people's uprising and there was a police riot. Ultimately, Norm Stamper, the police chief, was tossed out. And he would later say that, this was the worst mistake of his life. And he would become a staunch advocate of the demilitarization of police, going right through to Standing Rock, where you have these militarized sheriff departments on these rural back roads that are meeting defenseless or let's just say nonviolent water protectors who are doing water ceremonies and offering water to the sheriff's deputies to say, we're protecting your water as much as ours. And they would be met by MRAPs and automatic weapons and mace and tear gas and drones. These all coming from often Afghanistan and Iraq, being given to the police departments of this country. This is recycling in America today. But Rick, if you can talk about covering that police riot and what that meant, and then move it forward to, you're in the middle of almost every major protest.
Yeah, I also remember early on in the protests in Seattle, they ran out of tear gas. They used everything they had up, and so they resupplied from the state prison system, and brought in a new sort of, just making it incredibly clear how the carceral state kind of penetrated into this policing matrix that was there. It was. The kind of restrictions on free speech that were put in place by the police in Seattle, it was the first time that I'd seen those sort of like the massive exclusion zones, the creation of little protest pens where it was okay for you to be and everywhere else was not. They arrested 600 people in the end, hundreds and hundreds of arrests, filled the jails. But what we saw, I think, at every point was that those methods backfired. You fill the jail with 600 organizers, and they organize the jail. It was, and that's exactly what happened. It was amazing. The last day when the ministerial was ending, there were several hundred people out in front of the jail. And in this amazing, festive, incredible rally where they're negotiating, with the mayor over the release of the protesters. The protesters can hear them and are hammering on the windows. Tom Hayden is up on doing call and response on the mic, and then they announce that the entire ministerial has collapsed, and that it was a complete unqualified victory for everyone. It was truly stunning. But we saw over the course of the next few years. We went from there to, it was A16, the World Bank protests in D.C. There were, I'm not even going to remember half of them. There was, the FTAA in Quebec. There was the Geneva protest where Jackie got her teeth broken. I spent 4 days in jail in Genoa at the G8 protest when they started. It was before that actually in Sweden, I think, when they started killing protesters in the street. And then it climaxed in Genoa in 2001, where they murdered Carlo Giuliani 2 blocks away from me. Carabinieri just shot him 2 feet away, right between the eyes. And then, of course, September 11th happened, and the lead up to the war in Iraq, and that changed everything. It wasn't September 11th that changed everything. It was the war in Iraq that changed everything for our movement, because we knew this was coming, and we did everything that it was in our power to do to stop it. We organized what had been up to that point the largest one-day protest ever, 3 million people, I'm going to say, in New York City. A couple million in London. Everywhere on the globe, this massive popular outcry to stop this war, and it had absolutely no effect at all. George Bush came on the screen and said, this is a focus group, and I don't need to listen to this focus group. And he went to war, and the movement that we were in was disarticulated by that war, and we got lost for a decade in just, we went from being agents in history. We were the hinge that a new world was opening up on. We were going to make a new world in my lifetime, I believed, right? And then we were trapped, spectators on a train that was wrecking all around us. We had been made, complicit in one of the most massive global crimes of my lifetime. In 1,000 years, we will not be forgiven for what we did to Baghdad. And And so, and so we went from, from believing that we were changing the world in our lifetime to being powerless to do anything more but bear witness to a violence that we weren't always certain that we wanted to survive. And then a lot of people were lost in that darkness. And some people came out the other side. And now we're here, and there are so many new exciting things that are emerging. But one of the things that in echo that I feel from those days in the 90s is the 90s, it was a moment of the absolute, we were living in the rubble of neoliberalism, right? Like everything was destroyed. And there was this explosion, this unleashing of populist energies. And the left won. I mean, we controlled them, right? We defined the narrative. It was our story that we were telling, right? I mean, right after Seattle, A16 in DC was next against the IMF, and Pat Buchanan came out and he tried to say, this is like, it's time for nativist workers, white workers in America to get together and stop these jobs going overseas, and like that. And there was that potential for that kind of organizing. Right or left populism was possible in that moment. And so after Seattle, when we made This Is What Democracy Looks Like, we made a film out of the footage of the 100 videographers who came to Seattle to shoot it, self-consciously from the beginning, to form a narrative around it that made it clear that this was a global movement that could not be co-opted and contained by the nativist forces of white supremacy. Right now, we're more unequal than we were in the 90s. We're in a moment where, with economic inequality we haven't seen since the Gilded Age. And these populist energies are unleashed, and there's a battle now between the left and the right over who is going to organize these people. And if we don't organize them, someone else is going to. And so, what Unicorn Ride is doing, which is, I think, is so important, is they're going straight into that breach, and they're engaging with, and they're fighting the Nazis. I mean, to make it as clear as it can possibly be. But it's, and that is crucial work, and I try to do that sometimes too. But but I think more important for us is for us to be able to express again a vision, to win the battle of dreams and nightmares, which we did back then, and we can do again.
If you want to pick up on that, Jeff, talking about where indymedia.org went after the Battle of Seattle.
Sure. I mean, I'll be brief because I know tomorrow there's going to be a full day of discussion, so I really encourage folks to show up and really dig into all this. As was mentioned before, we did our best to kind of help proliferate the model while also kind of encouraging folks to critique it, make it appropriate for their local particularities, to try to improve and address the hierarchies that kind of creep in again based on what we have internalized from society around race and class and gender and all these identities, and how that plays out even in kind of attempts at horizontal organizing. But yeah, we were going from city to city. There were at a certain point over 200 different indie media sites in 38 different countries. Many different languages, and there was truly, as was mentioned earlier, I think by Todd, you could check in at any time on the global site, and it was just information flowing in from this it was live feeds from all over the world of resistance that we want to see in the world that we need to build. So. As Rick just mentioned, there were a number of significant political events, global events that definitely hurt the momentum of the project. But I'm also encouraged by the fact that as surveillance capitalism takes over these platforms and controls Facebook and all these ways that we are now communicating in lieu of what was a commons, kind of indie media commons, that there's there's still a number of indie media sites. There's Unicorn Light. There's projects in Tunisia. Everywhere the global capital goes, we go, and there's resistance to it. And I have a 14 and a half, he'd make me say 14 and a half year old son, Joaquin, who has grown up obviously after a lot of the events that we're talking about tonight, historically, and he's grown up in an age of cell phones where you can immediately share the image and video and that sort of stuff, and there's selfie culture and all this sort of stuff, and I sometimes, as the old boomer type, lament that it seems sometimes very self-involved, right? And of course, the technology is very valuable in many ways because you can tell your own story, and that's something that we didn't have before, and especially for marginalized, underrepresented folks, that's especially crucial in this time and in all times. But I also think that it's created a culture that is very individualistic, and as I tried to mention earlier, and the rise of this project was really built on a collective of collectives, a network of collectives and collaboratives into which individuals were able to plug in. But the core of it, what made it possible, the infrastructure were these collectives that had been built up over time. So that's really my plea and my encouragement to my son, is that we need to invest in building that infrastructure, and that takes time and hard work and dealing with our isms, dealing with our communication, the way we talk to each other, because the technology is there now. What we're lacking in a lot of ways, is the human infrastructure that links us and allows us to amplify that, that's not owned by Mark Zuckerberg or by Twitter, and it's kind of encircled those technologies. So I mentioned my son, and I just wanted to say, one of the things that gives me hope is this next generation of younger folks, because and just the example that I'll give is he was one of many young people in the Bay Area where I live and where he lives, participating in the global climate strike, youth-led, unprecedented as far as numbers, as far as how many people participated. So that gave me hope in and of itself. But also, he used almost the words that Rick's narration was. I said to him, well, what was so good about it? He said, in the streets, we felt really free, and that just gives me incredible hope. So I think that we can learn a lot from these lessons over time, hopefully, and we'll dig into it tomorrow, and also know that there's people, like what has been said, next weekend in other parts of the world, other parts of the U.S., who are working to figure these things out so we can build again.
I wanted to mix things up a little bit, and Juan, don't walk away so fast. Juan Gonzalez, Juan, come on forward. I wanted two Juans to come forward for a minute. Juan Gonzalez and Juan Carlos Davila. I wanted you both to come up for this reason. This is really the beginning of this really important weekend. But you had this historic moment in Puerto Rico where you had the only time a governor was thrown out in the United States, because as it stands now, Puerto Rico is a part of the United States, thrown out in the history of this country, as Juan has also pointed out so eloquently. And I was just wondering, as we talk about what's happening today, the importance of independent media. Juan Carlos, you are doing a documentary, and you've been for years covering the grassroots movements that led to this overthrow. And Juan, you have been quite involved right now when the Center for Independent Journalism came up to New York, involved with their fundraising and what they're doing. They just won some very big awards. The people, the journalists who are not part of the mainstream media, who obtain these remarkable 800 pages of emails and texts and chats with the governor and his cronies, that only with the support of activists, groups that had hardly been recognized, certainly by the corporate media, ended up tossing out the governor. And Juan Carlos, if you can talk about that work.
Yeah, so maybe this is something that I'm also going to say tomorrow, but in Puerto Rico, certainly the Center for Investigative Journalism played a huge role in leaking the chats that of the governor, that as many of you, I'm pretty sure, have heard, it contained a lot of profanity, it contained a lot of misconduct of the governor alongside with his executive aides. It promoted misogynist, homophobic language, which the governor constantly encouraged in the chats, and they even made fun of Maria's deaths. And the chats also showed questionable, ethical problems, ethical conflict of interest within the administration, right? So, just to summarize, a bit of what was there in the chats, and the Center for Investigative Journalism had someone who leaked about almost 900 pages of a chat message, of a chat conversation, a Telegram conversation with the governor, with his executive team, and I think that's very important. That was very crucial because I don't know if actually if those chats have been leaked to Puerto Rican local mainstream media, if they would have actually put it out, or if they would actually, use it to play out their interests, right? So I think it's very important that that leak was to the Center of Investigative Journalism, which for so many years have been working with a little budget, right? I think now after the awards that they have made, and they have received more funding now, and it's so important that the Center for Investigative Journalism, which is in a way independent media too, operated, was able to survive all these years, because it was really a reliable source. And I think when I mentioned reliable source, it was also important because they have credibility. And I think, mainstream media has been losing so much credibility throughout the years, and people know that when actually the Center for Investigative Journalism put that out there, it was pretty much unquestionable. It was like, all right, this is from the center, so this must be true. So, and then, and that put a lot of pressure, which I think is the important thing of independent media. It put a lot of pressure so that the other mainstream media would follow, and that eventually it would follow here in the U.S. too. So, and then just quick, because I think we're going to keep talking about this tomorrow, but the other thing is that really, and there's independent media, and there's a lot of independent journalists that are just like shooting things that they're uploading themselves on the web or something, or they are making even like a short film or something, that are not necessarily working with within an organized institution. But after 11 p.m., when all the mainstream media just left the streets of San Juan, that's when the police started to getting very brutal and starting to abuse their power. And I think all the independent journalists or all the amateur journalists that were there played a huge role documenting that. And I think there's so much amazing footage out there that still hasn't been seen yet.
And Juan, if you wanted to comment on, as one of the organizers of this conference, but your long, reach back into history, co-founder of the Young Lords, and yet working in corporate media, and then seeing what happened in the place where you were born in Puerto Rico, and this historic uprising for the entire United States, not to mention the protests in Chile and Bolivia, what Puerto Rico meant.
Well, very quickly, because I'm more interested in hearing other people and their experiences, but I think the important thing to understand about what happened in Puerto Rico is, first of all, we often look to other parts of the world, to examples of American imperialism and colonialism. We forget that Puerto Rico remains the largest single, most important colony in the history of the United States. The Philippines was let go after a while by the United States, but Puerto Rico remains now a colony of the United States. And I think what happened this summer was really, while the Center for Investigative Journalism's reporting on the chats and the corruption within the government were the final straw, the reality is that this had been building really for years. There have been 3 major crises in Puerto Rico, not just in the last few years. One, the debt crisis in 2015, then Hurricane Maria and the aftermath of the failed and botched federal and local response. And I think that's where the importance of independent media first was shown, because when the entire communication system, not just the electrical system, but all the cell towers of the entire country failed, and that's not supposed to happen even for the 911 responders, that your entire communication systems fail. The people had to come up and devise ways to communicate themselves, and they did. It was a remarkable movement of people through social media trying to get out information on what was happening in every little town in Puerto Rico. So there was a whole network of people who on their own filled the void of the collapse of the communication system of the island. And then the tremendously inept and really racist response of the federal government in the way they dealt with Puerto Rico, and the wasting of the money that the federal disaster relief that came afterwards, and numerous scandals about how that money was misspent. So then, by the time the third crisis of the chats of the governor and the total disdain that the people in power had for their own citizens, I think that was it. That was the final straw. And so I think that the example that the people of Puerto Rico have set in actually forcing out a government, which has never happened in the history of Puerto Rico, never happened in the history of the United States, as far as I know. I mean, there may be a historian that knows something about what happened somewhere else, but I don't think that there's ever been a governor forced out by popular protest in the United States. So I think that really sets an example of what can be done by people when they unite. Because remember, there was up to between 500,000 and 1 million people in the biggest of the protests in Puerto Rico. There's only 3.2 million people on the whole island. Right? And the 500,000 to 1 million people came out in protest. That's an extraordinary percentage of the entire population of the country. There's no way that a leader could stay in power at that level of discontent among the population. So I think it's an important lesson of what can be done, and that these mass struggles, as I tried to say earlier, in the 60s, when we were in Chicago, I was running the streets of Chicago with Tom Hayden and Bernadine Dorn and Mark Rudd and Billy Ayers and Jeff Jones and all these other folks that were out there, Susie Stern and all these other folks, Abby Hoffman. We believed we were going to change the world. And the thing that you have to understand is that capitalism and imperialism is an amazingly resilient system. It figures out what the threats are, adjusts its strategies and approaches, and finds ways, even if they have to concede social change for 10, 15 years, as long as they can hold on to power, that's worth it, because they can always beat back those changes later on. So the important thing is the resilience of the system to be able to maintain itself in power, and therefore we can never be lulled into thinking that the temporary victories we have today will persist into the future. But they must always be guarded, and they must always be renewed, because there will be constant attempts to beat back the change. And I think that that's the important lesson that every generation has to learn, is that this system didn't get to be, and this country did not get to be the imperial power it is by accident. And therefore that the movements seeking to force change have to be a lot more vigilant and a lot more looking toward the long term, not just the short term.
And I just